Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM. My guest tonight is Clive Boddy. He's the author of Corporate Psychopaths, Organizational Destroyers. Now, you also have a university connection, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm Professor of Leadership and Organisational Behaviour at Middlesex University in the UK.
Okay. So you've got this book and you've been writing, and it's really an academic professional book. This is not a book for laymen. It's citing research, and this is the target of this is academics, or who's the target for this book?
Yeah, that's right. It's basically an academic book detailing my research on corporate psychopaths and their effects on organisations. It's the research I undertook in Australia a few years ago. So yeah, it's that particular book is aimed at an academic audience. So, although I am writing a popular version of it now, unfinished yet.
Okay, so and you have a chapter in your book that's also a standalone article in the Journal of Business Ethics titled "The Corporate Psychopaths Theory of the Global Financial Crisis."
Yes, that's right. I expanded that into a small article in that journal. Yeah, created a bit of interest among the general public and financial insiders.
Yes, you've gotten some Google exposure there in a lot of different ways. So, and I found you with your TED Talk on psychopaths and corporate bullies.
Yeah.
So I want to get an understanding of this. Recently, I did an interview with psychiatrist Donald Black, who wrote a book, Bad Boys, Bad Men, which is about sociopaths. Now, he says sociopaths and psychopaths are the same thing. There are 8.5 million of them. Now, I know that others say that there are about 1 million psychopaths in the U.S., and that's what's his name? Robert
Hare. Yeah.
Robert Hare, yes, the author of Snakes in Suits, which is about corporate psychopaths. And I'm not the expert to sort out which is the right answer. Now, I understand that you base your work on Hare's numbers, or at least when you talk about the numbers, you use Hare's numbers, right?
Yeah, I prefer his definition of psychopaths and sociopaths as well, because he differentiates the two.
Okay. Could you differentiate them for us here?
Yeah, sure. Well, in a nutshell, the word sociopath, because of its associations with socialization and learned behavior, implies a person who has been brought up or cultured or educated to be a sociopath. In other words, to have a ruthless personality. Whereas a psychopath seems to be more born than made, and so they have a series of brain chemistry and connectivity abnormalities, if you like, which seem to predispose them to have no conscience. And it's that lack of conscience that makes them ruthless towards other people and to behave in the characteristic ways of psychopaths.
Heartless.
That's right, yeah. Totally heartless, totally ruthless, and totally calculating in their approach to life.
So you start your book with an introduction, which is the same as the title. Corporate Psychopaths as Organizational Destroyers. What do you mean by organizational destroyers?
Well, just as it sounds, basically. What I've done is research the effect they have on other employees and on the organizations that employ them, by using a psychopathic measure to identify their presence in organizations, and then looking at the effects of companies where they are present compared to where they're not present. And all the key indicators that I've looked at so far increase in their presence. So conflict and bullying go up enormously. Workload goes up slightly. Counterproductive work behaviour goes up because people take revenge against what they see as the bad behaviour of the company in the form of their psychopathic manager. Employee emotional well-being goes down, so they don't feel like they are cared for by the company, and they don't think as if they don't feel as if they fit in there because of the actions of their psychopathic manager again. Perceptions of organisational justice and ethics and management credibility and management trustworthy all go down in their presence, because of their orientation is towards themselves rather than towards the company. It's towards themselves rather than towards other employees, and it's towards themselves rather than towards the customers. So the customers get neglected, the employees get neglected, and the company itself gets neglected, and that's why they have a destructive effect on the organisation that employs them. So it's a long-term series of gradually, increasingly bad organisational outcomes, which ultimately I think will probably result in the disintegration of the company.
And there has been other research, I think it's Kall has done some research on this, that has shown that the return on assets, for one, is much less when a psychopath runs the company.
I haven't actually heard of that piece of research, but I usually try and keep up to date on everything that's published on psychopaths.
I may not have cited it exactly right, but I'm pretty sure that's along the lines of what he came up with. He apparently asked a lot of employees to describe characteristics of their bosses, and the ones that had characteristics that made them look like psychopaths, that had that result. It kind of makes sense if you're destroying the company that it's going to make less money or lose money, though.
Oh yeah, it makes perfect sense, but I'll have to look up that piece of research. Kyle, you say?
I'll send you the link to it when we're done.
Okay, thanks.
And it'll be on the page for the podcast as well. Okay, so you say one thing, and I'm not sure where you said it. You were cited by a Bloomberg article on this. You said anyone who makes decisions that affect significant numbers of other people concerning issues of corporate social responsibility or toxic waste, for example, or concerning mass financial markets or mass employment should be screened to make sure that they are, at the very least, not psychopaths, and at most are actually people who care about others.
Well, yes, I think mankind appears to be standing on the brink of so many different types of unpleasant results in terms of the economy, in terms of the environment, in terms of overfishing in the sea. But I think we have reached a stage where we really need to make sure that the people who are leading us in organisations of any kind are not psychopathic and therefore have a conscience. Because otherwise the decisions that are being made are going to be short-term, profit-oriented decisions to the benefit of the managers concerned rather than to the long-term benefit of the rest of society and the rest of mankind. So I think we've reached a critical stage, and now that we know how to identify these people, we have the means to manage them, to identify them and to manage them within organizations and society.
Now that is my next question. Do we have the means to identify them? Can they be identified so that we can prevent them from taking powerful roles where they can hurt people and companies?
Well, yeah, I mean, psychologists have a whole range of measures of psychopathy. So there are other report measures of psychopathy where you ask other people to rate an individual, people who know them well, so their subordinates, their superiors, etc. And there are also self-report measures of psychopathy where people complete their own questionnaires, self-complete a questionnaire, and from that you can identify whether someone scores highly on psychopathy measures or not. There are also increasingly functional magnetic resonance imaging brain scans, which show that the brains of these people work differently to the rest of us. So that's additional. Once you get to very senior levels, that's perhaps an additional type of screening that could be used to identify them. And if you get all three measures, say, giving the same results, so brain scans, self-report measures, other report measures, then you can be pretty certain that you're dealing with somebody who's at least highly dysfunctional.
Now, I've written about this a bit, and the commenters have expressed concerns that this is not a mature science, that it's an art. They've expressed concern that psychopaths, if they're going to be asked questions, are going to lie. So the self-report questions, for example, are they reliable? Can useful information come from them? Do people actually answer questions that end up indicating they're psychopaths? How's that work?
Well, some of the self-report measures, there's one called the Psychopathic Personality Inventory, I think it's called, and that, as far as I know, has built-in measures of reliability. So it can tell whether the respondent is trying to massage the image that they give or not through their answers. There are concerns about them lying, of course, because that's one of their stock in trades. But I think that there exists sufficient variety of measures to get around that and to pinpoint them relatively accurately.
So are you doing consulting with businesses?
No, I'm not at the moment. I'm just doing my academic research.
Okay. What kind of response have you had from businesses in terms of these ideas of screening out psychopaths?
Limited response so far. I had an interesting presentation a few weeks ago. When I normally present on corporate psychopaths to people, around 40% of people think they've worked with this kind of person. Recently, as I said, I presented to a group of HR directors, and the interesting difference there was that all of them thought they'd worked with this kind of person. And I suppose because of the nature of their jobs, where they're dealing with senior people and recruiting them and interviewing them and assessing them, they're bound to come across them more often because they come across more people than the rest of us do. So, and they were very interested in the whole thing and very worried about it as well, because from their own experience, they found it incredibly difficult to manage these people, and especially when they were at higher levels than the HR directors in the organisation, which often they were. And we're just doing some research, excuse me, with those HR directors to discover a bit more about this and how they coped with the psychopaths or the potential psychopaths.
Do the HR directors screen out psychopaths? Are they doing anything at all to keep them out, whether it's intuitively or face judgment, or is there anything that they're doing now?
To the best of my knowledge, no, they're not looking for psychopathy in screening people. I believe one or two armed forces and one or two police forces around the world try and screen out psychopaths for obvious reasons. But as far as I know, that they're the only organisations that do it. You mentioned that corporate psychopaths theory of the global financial crisis. There was a report in the UK newspaper after that came out that at least one corporate bank in the UK was screening them in rather than screening them out. So the reporter was talking about the theory to a friend of his who was a corporate banker, and the banker said to him, "We used a psychopathy measure to recruit new employees." So you can use it, preferably to screen them in, but it's incredible that to screen them out rather. But it's incredibly to hear that they were using it to screen them in. And
The
I've
term
been trying to
pack
get
of
some funding
wolves
to do
comes to
that
mind.
research, but I haven't got any yet.
The term pack of wolves comes to mind.
It's unbelievable, yeah. It's
Yes.
mind-boggling.
It's hard to imagine somebody who would intentionally hire psychopaths not being a psychopath.
Well, presumably they thought they were getting ultra ruthless, cutthroat, competitive new employees who would help the business, but it's a very short-term and risky thing to do.
Now, you know the name of the company?
No, I haven't been able to find out which bank it was. As I say, I would love to do some further research into this, but I haven't been able to yet.
Now, you've said that companies tend to avoid even talking about this or dealing with it, that they sweep it under the carpet, pretend it doesn't exist, or pay off people who have been bullied by psychopaths, and then the bully, the psychopath, gets promoted.
Well, that was I think you've taken that from my TED speech on bullying, and that was more in relation to bullies in general, and bullying in general, rather than just psychopathic bullying. So companies find it very difficult, I think, to deal with bullying, and from my limited experience of it, they as you say, they tend to try and sweep it under the carpet or just ignore it and hope it will go away on its own. But it is a huge problem in companies around the world, as even a peripheral examination of the literature on bullying will show you that straight away.
You're listening to the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show or watching on YouTube. So what is the difference between a bully and a psychopath?
Well, I think people come to be bullies through a variety of different reasons, including their upbringing, the way they've been taught to deal with other people. Whereas a psychopath bullies for more instrumental reasons. They'll tend to bully to create in-groups and out-groups. They'll tend to bully to show other people that they're not to be taken lightly and shouldn't be challenged, unless the people who are challenging them can expect to be to meet some degree of force in retaliation. So they're spreading a ruthless reputation for themselves, so that people leave them alone, and that enables them to get on with what they're really doing, which is self-aggrandization and self-promotion. But they'll create divide and conquer tactics. So they'll instigate bullying among other people. So people will start to bully people in the out-group that the psychopath has created, to try and gain favour with the psychopath, and to make sure that they're not bullied themselves. So they create a culture, I think, of bullying and intimidation that goes on around them. So it's not just them doing it, it's them facilitating other people to do it as well, and creating the environment in which bullying flourishes.
Now, you did a study looking at psychopaths and bullies among managers, right?
Yeah.
What did you find?
Well, I found in the presence of corporate psychopaths within an organisation, all types of conflict go up. So arguments go through the roof, yelling goes up, conflict goes up, and bullying goes up enormously. And the presence of psychopaths in my Australian research seemed to account for about, I think it's 26% of all bullying, or a quarter. In some research I've just writing up in the UK, I found even more. I found about a third of all bullying is due to the presence of corporate psychopaths. So when they're not there, there's hardly any bullying, and when they are there, there's often frequent and repetitive bullying.
And what percentage are psychopaths in the corporate setting?
Well, I follow Hare again on this. It seems to be about 1% of the population, and therefore there's no real reason to believe that anything less than 1% shouldn't be in organisations. But the theory is that they're better at getting promoted than other people are, because of their superficial charm and their willingness to lie, their willingness to manipulate other people, their willingness to claim the good work of others as their own work, the lack of remorse about what they do and how they do it. And so it seems to be, from some studies that have been published in the US, that it could be 3.5% of senior managers who are corporate psychopaths. Now, there may well be, on top of that, an institutional effect, so that because they are after power, money, and prestige, they will tend to go towards the organizations that can provide those types of rewards. So that means they'll probably try and avoid the caring professions, for example, nursing maybe, that comes to mind, and gravitate towards the financial services and corporate banking sectors in particular. And so the 3.5% at the top of most organizations might be even more within the corporate banking sector, and especially if they've actually been recruiting these people to begin with.
Do psychopaths, are they able to work with other psychopaths, and what does that look like? That sounds really scary.
It is really scary. I've just started reading about political psychopaths, and I found that Adolf Hitler was diagnosed by a Norwegian psychiatrist in 1933. Long before his major atrocities committed, he was diagnosed as a psychopath. His deputy Hess was diagnosed as a psychopath by a British psychiatrist in 1941 when he flew to Scotland. And Goebbels was diagnosed as a psychopath at the Nuremberg war trials by a US psychiatrist. So all three of the top Nazis were psychopaths. So that answers the question, can they work together? And what happens when they do? So when they do work together, not only do they have no conscience of their own to restrain their behavior, but those around them have no conscience as well. And so the whole thing just becomes nightmarishly bad, to the point, I think, of being evil, you'd say.
How are corporate psychopaths different from other psychopaths?
We think that they have better executive control abilities stemming from either their better educational background and socio-economic upbringing, or it might be brain event related as well, but that's relatively unexplored at the moment. I mean, psychiatrists, because the first people to study psychopaths were prison psychologists like Robert Hare, for example, and because psychopaths are easy to find in prison populations, there became an element of confusion between what the criminals do and what the psychopaths do, and there was a confounding of the issue, and people tended to forget that psychopaths exist among us in society, working alongside us, and aren't always the very antisocial, very violent individuals that we have come to associate with psychopathy. So they're more restrained. They can control and modify their behaviour better in terms of its violent outbursts, and therefore they can exist relatively successfully in organisations and get to the top through other means, or through the means of manipulation that we've talked about.
Have there been any CEOs or high executives in corporations who have been clearly identified as psychopaths that you can name?
Because it's such a value-laden term, hardly any CEOs so far have been named as psychopaths. There are obvious candidates who might be associated with having a high psychopathy score, and I'm just in the process of writing about those people at the moment by comparing what they have done in history to a common measures of psychopathy. So a potential candidate, for example, would be a guy called Robert Maxwell in the UK, who used to be a media baron and he owned the Daily Mirror, for example, and he was found to have defrauded the pension fund of about £300 million, I think it was at the time, back in the late 80s, early 90s. When the fraud scandal was about to emerge into the spotlight of the media, he reportedly fell off his yacht in the Atlantic and drowned. But he's been mentioned in a few websites and a few newspapers as a possible candidate for a high psychopathy score.
So part of the criteria for diagnosing a CEO or a high-level corporate executive is he needs to be dead first?
Well, it makes the possibility of libel less.
That's true. The libel laws in the UK are much tougher than they are in the US, aren't they?
Yes. Several websites in the US do name people, but I'm not at liberty to repeat those names, I think, here.
Now, you have talked about Enron.
Yes. I mean, these spectacular corporate collapses that seem to have been driven by the very, what's the right word, self-aggrandizing CEOs and CFOs within the organizations are, if those people weren't psychopaths, then certainly the type of behavior and the type of conclusions that came about because of their presence would be expected from corporate psychopaths. So, I mean, fraud is the most commonly expected outcome from having a psychopath. But so far, there's no research that definitely links the two. But every psychologist who writes about them thinks they will engage in fraudulent behaviour. It's just that the connection in research hasn't been made yet from a scientific point of view.
Now, you mentioned in a couple different places dark leadership. What's that?
Well, it's just a broader term of dark or toxic leadership, a broader term than corporate psychopaths. I think corporate psychopaths are one of three different types of dark leaders, if you like. The next one being Machiavellians, which is somebody who's willing to do something regardless of the consequences to other people. And narcissists is the other one, who are people who basically love themselves too much and expect the admiration of those around them. So, I mean, and they have been called the dark triad in the psychology literature, for example. But theoretically, I think psychopaths would be the most destructive, because there's nothing to say that Machiavellians and narcissists don't have a conscience. I think the literature sort of assumes they do have a conscience, and therefore they have a better side to them which can be appealed to, whereas you can't. There's nothing to appeal to with a psychopath. In fact, they would see appeals as a form of weakness, a sign of weakness, rather than anything else.
Let's talk a little bit about your global psychopath theory of the corporate psychopath theory of the global financial crisis. What is it, and what kind of response have you had to your theory?
Well, it's the theory that corporate psychopaths in senior positions in corporate banks in the UK and the US and around the world, for that matter, had an influence on the spiraling levels of debt and the manufacturing of these derivative products, which appear to have no social or economic function other than to create paper profits and therefore bonuses for the managers concerned. These products were so complex that the people selling them didn't even understand them, and didn't understand therefore the riskiness of them. And that begs the question, of course, what kind of people will sell a product that they don't understand themselves and don't understand the risk of themselves? And it's got to be someone who's deficient, at least in their conscience and their empathy for other people. So the theory was that because modern organisations are becoming more and more fluid, we don't get to know the people we work with like we used to. If you'd worked with someone in a company for 25 years, you would get to know that if there were elements of their personality that were strange or aberrant or ruthless, you'd get to know about it. You'd get to know how they treated their family, how they treated their wives, how they treated other people around them. And it might start ringing alarm bells as to their promotability and their suitability for management positions. But because modern organisations are so fluid and fast, so they have mergers and acquisitions, you have very fast turnover of personnel, especially in key positions these days. And so nobody gets to know anybody. And therefore, those who can give the best facade of being charming and sociable and capable get to the top quicker than perhaps more introverted people, or people who are less capable of putting themselves in a good light at such a short meeting or a short term of getting to know them. So the theory is that psychopaths are getting to the top more and more because of what's happening in terms of personnel turnover and in terms of the way companies recruit people and promote them within organisations. Therefore, they got to the top more in the corporate banking sector, and I think they'd be especially attracted to that sector because of the power and the money and prestige that can be earned within it. And especially if, as we've just discussed, well, at least one bank was using a psychopathy measure to recruit people. So their influence on the banks would be in an ethically negative direction, and they would affect the whole corporate culture to be more and more ruthless, more and more ego-driven, more and more risk-taking. So they develop a sociopathic culture around the senior psychopaths that were there. And you throw in a couple of narcissists and Machiavellians into the top management team as well, and you have the recipe where psychopaths can get to do what they want and can implement the organisational decisions that they favour for typically short-term results and short-term bonuses.
Yeah, it seems to me like what you're describing is the collapse of community and connectedness among people in companies. Because if you have more of that, then these kinds of behaviors are going to be more easily identified and detected and talked about and brought to leadership.
Yes, I think that's a good point. Where you have more and more connections, then you've got a greater chance of identifying them in the first place, and therefore restraining their influence or restraining their gaining of management positions.
It makes me think, I call my show the Bottom Up Radio Show. Most of the interviews I do are related to the idea that there's a transition from a top-down to a bottom-up world, our culture, our brains, and that people are getting more connected in some ways. But at the same time, there are problems that are affecting our connections, like globalization hurts community, consumer culture hurts community, and it seems to me that those kinds of things are having this side effect, really, that leads to opening up corporations to being more vulnerable, more susceptible to allowing the entry of these kinds of predators into their upper echelons.
Yes, I agree with that, and I think one of the things that can perhaps constrain it is there are a number of large European companies that tend to recruit at the graduate level and then they keep the people within the company for over a long-term career. And through doing that, they can get to know the people in greater depth, the employees in greater depth, and prevent them, the more aberrant personalities, from getting to the top. But sadly, even those companies which traditionally do that are now starting to look outside their own ranks to recruit people. And as soon as you start bringing in people who you don't know the true character of, then of course there's the danger of bringing in somebody who's too ruthless and too psychopathic.
Are there certain industries that tend to do that more than others?
Recruit and then keep the staff? You mean?
No, the industries that will hire people without knowing who they're hiring.
I don't know is the top of mind answer to that. I mean, okay. I don't think many people are many organisations are very thorough in terms of establishing the true contacting referees and people who have worked with people to check that they are okay individuals. I think these days it's very much the person appointed is the person that gives the best impression on the day of the interview. So there's not much background checking anymore by any organisation, I don't think. And obviously there needs to be.
I am inclined to go back to my question about the idea of corporations actually doing screenings. Now, you've said that this could be important and valuable, but they're not doing it. Do you see that as something that could develop, or are we to expect to see more and more psychopaths running and at high levels of corporations?
The way society is going and the way organisations are going, I think we're moving towards having more and more of them emerge because of the speed of change that's happening and the way people are recruited. On the other hand, I think the message about psychopaths existing at the corporate level is now fairly well known, and therefore people more at the grassroots might demand or come to demand that these people are properly screened before they're given very senior jobs. And I think the higher the job, the more compelling the argument is to check their backgrounds and check the people they've worked with and see what kind of person they're really like.
It would be interesting if there were some kind of crowdsourcing technology that would allow employees to, in some way, report. But of course, then the sociopaths would have access to it too. And that's been a big concern of some of my readers, that any technology that identifies sociopaths can be used by sociopaths too. And perhaps like that one banker that's has been hiring sociopaths, screening for them.
Yes, quite. Yeah, and I don't know how to get around that, I'm afraid.
Yeah. One of the things that interested me was in light of this global financial crisis, corporate psychopath theory, is you said that when large financial corporations are destroyed by the actions of their senior directors, employees lose their jobs and sometimes their livelihoods, shareholders lose their investments and sometimes their life savings, and societies lose key parts of their economic infrastructure. Capitalism also loses some of its credibility. Is capitalism threatened by corporate psychopaths?
Well, if you associate them with the global financial crisis and the potential role they had within, it's fair to say that crisis did threaten capitalism itself because it was so potentially destructive to the whole economic system of the world. Going back a little bit to your question about that theory, if you've looked at some of the financial websites like Bloomberg, for example, where the financial insiders are commenting on the theory, the reaction seems to be almost one of here's another academic who's coming late to the party. We already knew this. We've known that there are corporate psychopaths in the financial sector for ages. So it's a kind of resigned cynicism that you read within the comments in some of the financial websites that have published comments about the theory. And there's a recognition that these people exist. There's a recognition that they work in the banking sector, especially the corporate banking sector. But there's no perceived ability to do anything about it.
Well, we know that Eric Holder, the Attorney General for the United States, has not prosecuted any bankers or financial people. It looks like it's a good, safe place for a psychopath to go if they don't want to get prosecuted or arrested.
Yeah, quite, yes.
So, who do psychopaths surround themselves with? Tell me a bit about that.
Well, I think they try and avoid people who would try and regulate their activities. So they surround themselves with yes men, in other words, or people who will just agree with them, or side with them, or be part of their in-group, so that they can generate the outcomes that they want to generate. So those who are easily led, which unfortunately it means most people most of the time, and those who are willing to go along with what they do in the hope of getting some smaller set of benefits for themselves. So, in other words, other selfish people who might not be psychopaths themselves, but are willing to compromise their ethics for the sake of financial or other rewards.
It makes me think of in the Nazi prison camps, there were people, I think they were called capos, who were prisoners, but they helped keep order among the other prisoners, and they got extra cigarettes and food as benefits for that. Sounds like that kind of person.
Well, obviously that's an extreme environment where people were under enormous pressures of life and death. So they may have been people without a conscience, or they may have been people who were trying to help those around them through whatever way they could do it.
Okay.
I don't think it might be harsh to condemn those people in that kind of environment without knowing more about them.
Okay. Are there people, and I think you got into this a little bit.
I just have to have a drink.
Go ahead. Are there people who are more vulnerable to psychopaths? Any particular characteristics of people with certain characteristics or personalities?
That's a good question. Psychopaths on the criminal side seem to be very good at picking their victims. So victims who are in some way vulnerable or weak or sad or lonely or injured, or so I suppose it goes back to the description of psychopaths as predators. So they prey on the weak because the weak are less likely to fight back. So I suppose that's the answer that I'd come up with there. Does that answer the question?
It's kind of not. I don't know. I was hoping for a little more, but it's okay. I mean, you're not a psychologist, are you?
No.
What are you exactly?
Well, a management researcher is the way I describe myself these days. I used to run market research companies in the Far East, so Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, those areas.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about how psychopaths operate within a corporation. What do they do, and what kind of behaviors do they engage in that get them forward, that hurt others, that hurt the company? How do they deal with times when they are being threatened, or where somebody's calling them out or anything like that? Can you give some more detailed descriptions of their behaviors?
Yeah, I think when they go into an organisation, they start to formulate a plan as to how they can advance themselves by manipulating and using other people. So they might identify key gatekeepers in the organisation who can help them get to important people. They'll do things like, if they make a mistake, they'll blame other people for it. If someone working for them does very good work, they'll claim the credit for that work themselves. They'll try and anticipate anybody who is going to try and undermine their position, and they'll in turn undermine their position first. So if somebody who worked for psychopaths was going to report them to their own superior, they're above the psychopath might go to that person first and say, I'm having trouble with this guy. I think he doesn't like my management style. He's being a bit disruptive. And so he undermines that person. And when when that person goes to report on the psychopath, the boss figure has already been warned about him, and therefore doesn't believe what he says about the psychopath. So they are in a strategic game, and the rest of the people in the company don't realise they're in a game. They just think it's a normal social interaction. And because they're planning it ahead of everyone else, that gives them the advantage and the ability to get ahead of people before people even realise what's happening. And by the time they do realise, it's too late to do anything about it.
Now, you did a study with 300 plus management people where you included in a questionnaire some items that would help to identify psychopaths, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So, how many psychopaths did you find?
Well, we weren't looking for individual psychopaths. We were looking for people who had worked with them, or people whose current manager scored highly enough on the psychopathy scale or measure to be classed as a corporate psychopath.
Okay, so you were actually doing a questionnaire to identify managers of the employees taking the questionnaire.
That's right, yeah. So we asked them about their current manager, and within those questions is a psychopathy measure, and if the current manager scores highly enough on that measure, then we'll call them a corporate psychopath. And in Australia, we found that about, I think it was 5.75% of people were working with a current manager who could be described as a psychopath because they scored highly on the measure we were using, or I was using. In the UK, we did the same thing, but it was a different set of organisations. It was more marketing services oriented rather than a general managerial population. And we found about 9% of people were working with a corporate psychopath in that environment. So statistically speaking, there was no difference between the two if it was a test of statistical differences.
Okay.
But still, it was an interesting finding.
Yes, it certainly is. So, can you tell me a bit more about, did you do interviews with the people who had psychopaths as supervisors at all? Did you find out about what it was like working for them? I know you have some stats on bullying, but individually, did you get reports about what it felt like or any of those kinds of things?
No, but we've looked at in the UK research, which is largely unreported as of yet. We looked at employee emotional well-being, and all the measures of that go down in the presence of corporate psychopaths. So people don't think they belong, they don't think they're properly rewarded for what they do, they don't think the company's got any meaning for them, and they don't feel satisfied with what they're doing and how they're doing it. So at the more personal and emotional level, we're doing this qualitative research among HR directors that I talked about before, and that's where we're aiming to get a much more qualitative and in-depth and meaty, if you like, understanding of what happens and how it happens. And we've only done a couple of interviews so far, but one of the HR directors had identified somebody he thought might be a psychopath and who ticked all the boxes on our measure. And this person wanted to fire people, but they specifically wanted to fire them on Christmas Eve. And it's that kind of finding which I think throws light on the true personalities of these people.
Now, I run a website that sees about 250,000 people a month. I'm curious about psychopaths and websites and internet behavior. Do you have any insights on those people?
No, I'm afraid, no.
No?
No.
Okay. Now, in your book, I'm looking at the chapter titles. You've got one, organizational seniority of corporate psychopaths. What's that about?
Well, this is about the idea that they are better at getting to the top levels than other people are because of their willingness, as I've said, to con, to claim the work of others as their own, and their self-promotion activities, basically. There's relatively little evidence to show that that is the case, but the evidence that does exist, as I've said, seems to indicate a distribution of between 1% at the bottom and 3.5% or maybe 4% at the top. So they do seem to be better at getting to the top than other people are. But of course, we're still only talking a minority of managers. But the effect of that minority is significant because they are so extreme in their behaviour and they influence other people to be ethically negative as well.
It creates a culture.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, followers learn how to behave by observing their leaders. So if they observe leaders who are self-interested, self-satisfied, egotistical, grandiose, willing to lie, willing to manipulate, then of course that spreads down the organisation, and the whole organisation becomes sociopathic rather than normal. And so they have a malign influence on everybody around them. And of course, that influence at senior levels is magnified because of the nature of their leadership position. And we know from the psychological experiments in the 50s that Milgram, for example, undertook, that people tend to obey authority. So these people, when they get to the top, aren't questioned and aren't challenged because people don't have the moral autonomy to question them. They don't have the bravery, the moral bravery to question them or to go up against them. And when they do, of course, if you go up against someone who's higher up than you in an organisation, then it's you that will tend to be the victim rather than the person you're whistleblowing on or reporting on.
And of course, we know now that whistleblowers in the U.S. are being punished and prosecuted at a higher rate than ever before in history. So in a sense, whistleblowers are one of the ways to fight against.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So if whistleblowing is increasing, that must mean, theoretically, logically, that the problem is increasing.
No, it's not increasing. What's happening is it's being punished, so it's not increasing, while it should be.
Yeah.
Now, the next chapter you have is corporate psychopaths and organizational type. What's that about?
Well, that's just the idea that they are more attracted to some organisations than they are to others. So if the aim is to get money and power and prestige and control over other people, then some organisations would appear logically to be more attractive. So corporate banking holds more of the promise of wealth than nursing does. or caring for the elderly does. So I think they'll gravitate towards the positions and the types of companies that give them the benefits that they seek out of life.
And that give them the opportunities to hide and evade detection.
Well, I think they can evade detection fairly well wherever they are.
Really?
I mean, obviously, the criminal ones who can't control their violent behaviour inevitably rub up against the law and end up in jail. But the corporate ones who are more sophisticated can outmaneuver those who try and control them, typically, because, as I've said, they have this plan that the rest of us don't have, and they use people like pawns on a chessboard, with people not even realising that they're being used and manipulated. And that gives them the advantage.
Do psychopaths and corporations have anything to worry about in the next coming years, that they're going to be found out and thrown out, or worse, prosecuted, jailed, whatever is appropriate, or are they pretty safe?
Unfortunately, they seem pretty safe at the moment. I mean, there is a company in the US which offers psychopathy screening. I've no idea how big the company is or how often they're called in to do that. But it does seem to be a minority or a very small minority, probably, of companies that are looking at this seriously at the moment. And as you've said, a lot of the unethical behaviour that's taken place in the banking sector hasn't been punished at all.
Yes. So, your final chapter is ethical issues involving corporate psychopaths. What's that about?
It's basically recognising that there are ethical issues in controlling and managing corporate psychopaths, because obviously they before they've done anything wrong, they have just as much right to earn a living as the rest of us do. It's only at the stage where they are being destructive that we have the ethical reason to control their behaviour. So there are ethical issues to do with identifying them, measuring them, labelling them, certainly, and then managing them as well. And that's more the province of philosophers and ethicists than it is my province. But people are looking at that in the philosophy journals and areas like that.
Are they? That's good to know. I'll be looking out for that. Maybe you, after we're done, you can point me in some directions there. And I'm also interested in finding out about that company that does the identification for corporations. I'd love to find out what they're up to.
Yeah, I think that's Robert Hare's. He's as far as I know, he's a shareholder in the company.
Good.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is the ethics of this is that it's unethical to prevent the wolf from going into the hen house and doing anything.
I'm sure that philosophers would say that, yes.
Until the wolf bites off a hen's head or something.
Yeah, it's perhaps a slightly misleading analogy, but yes.
What's misleading about that?
Because when they go in the hen house, they don't look like a wolf. So you
That's how you started your TED Talk. What do psychopaths look like?
Well, they present, because they are not nervous, because they're not neurotic, because they don't have the emotional response that the rest of us do. They come across as better than most people. So they're charming, they're extroverted, they're pleasant to talk to, they seem socially interesting, they can give plausible stories about themselves and their future and what they're going to do for the company. And so they look like ideal employees, and later on when they get to the promotion interviews, they look like promotable employees as well. And so when they start to implement their divide and conquer tactics and their manipulation and their conflict and bullying within organizations, they're the only ones who remain emotionally detached because they don't get emotional. And so if anybody was looking down at this situation from a senior hierarchical organizational position, it would look like the psychopath was actually the only person who wasn't behaving irrationally, and therefore they'd look like somebody who was promotable or somebody who should be managing that situation. So they gain both ways. They create the emotional trauma for other people, and then can potentially benefit from it because they can manipulate themselves into looking good compared to everyone else.
Well, it's time to wrap up this conversation. Anything you want to finish up with at all?
Yes. As I said, I'm aiming to do more research in this area, and I would urge other people to do, other academics that is, to do the same. I mean, when I first started researching it, the reaction was among academics was almost that it's the juxtaposition of the two words, corporate and psychopath, was too much for some people to imagine in the same sentence, and they certainly 8 years ago when I started, people didn't really take it as seriously as I think it should be taken. But that is changing now.
That's good to hear. Well, thank you. This is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM. I've been speaking with Clive Boddy, the author of Corporate Psychopaths. What's the rest of it there?
Organizational Destroyers.
Organizational Destroyers. Thanks for being on the show.
You're welcome. Nice